Good evening. Good evening. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the relationship of General Grant and General Rosecrans. Their professional relationship was um, marred by some pretty severe misunderstandings. This should be considered a history book report. And I'm Billy Voight, and we're with the Mid-Missouri Roundtable in Columbia, Missouri. And there's a couple of terms I would like for our future viewers on YouTube to know correct pronunciation is Corinth, Mississippi, and Iuka, Mississippi. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So that is my wife, and we were just there in Iuka in the Corinth area about 6 weeks ago. We're going to be revisiting the historiography of the stormy relationship between Generals Grant and Rosecrans. This should be considered a challenge to historians and researchers and academics and history buffs to examine multiple sources of information and data before reaching your conclusion. The book report is on the book to the left of your screen. It's called General Grant and the Rewriting of History, how the destruction of General Rosecrans influenced our understanding of the Civil War. The book on the right is not covered in this, but it has in this report, but the book on the right would have to do with General Grant in relationship to some other generals who sometimes fell into General Grant's disfavor. That would be Gouverneur Warren, Joe Hooker, and Rocca Chickamauga himself, George H. Thomas. Although Grant had a decided distaste for these generals, it was not to the level of contempt he expressed for General Rosecrans. Dr. Frank Varney is the author of the book we're under discussion tonight. He received his master's and PhD from Cornell. He's a retired professor from Dickinson State University of North Dakota, Dickinson, North Dakota. Dr. Frank Varney. Varney has thoroughly examined original sources such as letters, journals, reports, memoirs of other witnesses, and official record reports of officers other than Grant. He's analyzed Rosecrans' January 1865 testimony before the Joint Congressional Committee of the Conduct of the War. He studied transcripts of court-martials and the 62 boxes of Rosecrans papers housed at UCLA. The purpose of Varney's book is not a per se attack on Grant. Rather, it's a fresh, unvarnished look at the documentary evidence. Professor Varney's examination of Grant began as a matter of professional curiosity. While rereading Grant's memoirs, he noticed that General Grant was not shy about criticizing others, in particular his subordinates, and that many of the things General Grant said about other people pretty much conformed to the standard line about those people. Dr. Varney began to wonder whether perhaps some of these individuals were really as bad as Grant said they were, or was he simply reflecting what was conventional wisdom at the time, or had he, Grant, in fact, helped to shape the opinions we have of those people? In modern terminology, we might ask to what extent did General Grant set the narrative for public discourse of both federal and, by extension, Confederate Civil War officers? Grant may have been asking himself something like, what about the optics? How's what I'm going to write? How will that look to current and future generations? And consequently, how the Union Army won the war. And lastly, Professor Varney questions if, as is commonly believed, Grant was such a poor judge of character, and that's referring to his administration and some of the things that went on in his administration. Grant was a poor judge of character. Why should we uncritically accept what he said about people? There's a picture of the Tishomingo County Courthouse Museum that I visited twice now. If you're ever in northern Mississippi, I would encourage you, if you're in the Corinth and Iuka and Shiloh area, to stop in and visit that courthouse museum. It's a wonderful museum. After spending 5 years examining this record, it's a proposition of Dr. Varney that U.S. Grant used his official reports, interviews with the press, and his memoirs to influence how future generations would remember the war and his part in it. Aided greatly by his 2 terms as president, by the clarity and eloquence of his memoirs, and in particular by the dramatic backdrop against which those memoirs were written, our historical memory has been influenced to a degree greater than many of us realize. And I would note General Rosecrans' papers, if I understand it correctly, fill 64 boxes and are housed at the University of California at Los Angeles. Professor Varney examined all of that evidence in writing his book. According to Dr. Varney, Grant has colored, that's misspelling, Grant has colored, if not essentially written, the historical record. Grant did not give Rosecrans credit he deserved for the victories at Iuka and Corinth. Grant did his best to discredit the victory Rosecrans won at Stones River. Grant failed to support Rosecrans during the Chickamauga campaign, unfairly removed him from his command of the Army of the Cumberland, and removed him again after Price's raid into Missouri in 1864. Grant removed Rosecrans from the Department of Missouri because he didn't drive Price out fast enough, as I understand it. There were at least 4 instances, according to Dr. Varney, where evidence indicates Grant went so far as to falsify official War Department records. I know that's a very serious charge, and it pains me to make that charge about a United States Army officer in particular, but I don't really know any other way. Mindful of General Grant's memoirs have never gone out of publication. The picture on the right is believed to be the last picture ever taken of General Grant at his cottage in upstate New York when he was just finishing his memoirs. The picture in the center, to give you some idea of the popularity of General Grant, I believe that's on Broadway in Manhattan. His funeral. Grant had 3 funerals, this being the 3rd and final one, and I believe it's attended there on Broadway Street by some 10,000 people in his funeral procession for witnessing it. We should ask ourselves, why have so many historians accepted Grant at his word instead of looking at other accounts and examining other available data? The reason Grant has been extensively covered in the history books. Unfortunately, when you look at the citations used by those who have covered him, many of them use Grant himself as their chief source of information. Often the footnotes reference other historians who themselves use Grant almost exclusively. One example would be Grant's sycophantic staff officer, Adam Badeau. Not many historians have challenged Grant's veracity. If what he says disagrees with what another witness says, Grant generally holds sway. And I'm quick to add General Badeau served with distinction and was a very capable and brave soldier. He was wounded at Port Hudson, Louisiana, but I note he liked to sell books also. Varney's method is to name the names of historians and others who have accepted Grant's writing without reviewing other source documents. What do they say about being called out? And there's many historians that Professor Varney referenced. So many, I don't think it would hardly fit on one page in this just regular font. So I did not list any of them, but there are a great many in number that Varney cited as relying too exclusively and too heavily on General Grant's memoirs. Varney's book was a finalist for the prestigious Albert Castell Award, which indicates that many historians and researchers found it persuasive and worthwhile. According to Varney, The greatest percentage of responses were overwhelmingly positive. Most of the negative responses were from those who cherish Grant as an icon and resent any perceived attacks on him. Many online critics, which this will come as no surprise, many online critics who probably didn't even bother to read the book branded Barney as a, quote, revisionist historian, as though that were somehow an insult. One who came out in for the strongest criticism was Ed Bonekemper, author of several books on Grant. After reviewing Barney's work, Bonekemper was lavish in his praise and gracious in his acknowledgement of Barney's critique. Most serious students of the war seem to think Barney got it right. Active duty and retired Army officers seemed to enjoy the work and assured Barney that politics of command still worked precisely as he described it in the mid-19th century. According to Barney, there's as much danger in relying on the claims of Rosecrans as those of Grant. Both men were seeking to justify their actions after the fact. But many historians have long been accustomed to relying upon the unalloyed utterances of Grant. It is fair, at least, to let Rosecrans have his say, and for historians to work out their conclusions using more sources than simply Grant. There you see a picture of John Driscoll, who's on our broadcast tonight. He's the curator of the Iuka Courthouse Museum. What he's holding is a casualty report from General Little's division, the Confederate General Little at the Battle of Iuka. We should ask ourselves, one moment. We should ask ourselves what possible motive could Grant have for discrediting Rosecrans? The reason is very elusive. For example, Grant, Secretary of War Stanton, future President Garfield, and Dana were all Republicans. And I think Dana might have been chief of staff, I can't remember, but were all Republicans, and Rosecrans was a war Democrat. Perhaps the politically ambitious Grant was envious that Rosecrans was the recipient of multiple offers to run for both president and vice president. At various times, Rosecrans was approached as an alternative to Lincoln on the Republican ticket. You may recall, as the war went on, many of his own party were getting anxious about Lincoln's progress with the war. Rosecrans was approached as Lincoln's opponent on the Democratic ticket and as Lincoln's running mate. He declined the first two, but accepted the third as Lincoln's running mate in 1864. However, the political machinations prevented that from happening, however. Yes, he accepted. He sent the acceptance telegraph to Lincoln, but being routed through the offices in Washington, and it was routed through the Rosecrans telegram to Lincoln accepting the vice presidential nominee in 1864. That acceptance never reached President Lincoln. I should like to say, and giving the reasons Grant might have for discrediting Rosecrans, it is a commander's prerogative not to like any of his or her subordinates. I think that's understood, but what Grant had in for Rosecrans goes far beyond any mere dislike. It doesn't give anyone the right to make up stories and make statements that are untrue. Another reason, perhaps, is Rosecrans had uncovered something embarrassing to Grant when he, Rosecrans, was investigating speculation in black market cotton. Rosecrans and his chief of military police at Nashville, William Truesdale, headed the commission to investigate, and Grant's father had been involved vis-a-vis Cincinnati business associates. The report of the commission has vanished in spite of extensive efforts by Dr. Varney and others to find Rosecrans' report. It was last seen being given to a Grant staff officer about the time of Chickamauga and other events in Tennessee. What this is about is late 1862. You remember Grant started chasing, battling Confederates and some bushwhackers and guerrillas in northeast Missouri. And then they went to southeast Missouri, and you had Belmont. And then Grant went across the Mississippi into some action on the Tennessee River, which he captured the two forts. They'll come to mind, Donelson and the other. And then after Shiloh, and about that time, the Union Army went from fighting in Kentucky and Missouri and the border states. They started going into the deep South, and the further they drove, the question became, what do we do with all of the cotton? And of course, the cotton was needed just as much as ever in the Northeast and probably overseas as well. So it became a question as the Union Army occupied the cotton fields and plantations, what to do with the cotton. And of course, any profit from that was to go to the United States government. And it was at a fair. Apparently, there was some speculation that was going on, and Rosecrans ended up, and the military police, his chief of military police, ended up investigating that. And Grant's father's name came up with some of his business associations. It's thought perhaps that might be one reason why whatever was contained in that report might have been embarrassing to General Grant. There's also Grant's infamous General Orders Number 11, issued December 17th, 1862. To be considered, you must consider General Order Number 11, issued by Grant, in which Grant banished Jewish people from his area of authority on the grounds that they were engaged for profit in illegal activity that might assist the rebel cause, including cotton smuggling. There's a long story on this infamous Order Number 11. President Lincoln ordered Grant to rescind that order just about a week or 10 days later, and Grant did. Grant attempted to make concessions for that pretty much. Certainly after he became president, he appointed a disproportionate number of Jewish people to the patronage jobs and spoils system in his administration. He also began to promote Jewish causes in an effort to redeem himself. But anyway, it's thought that something along those lines might have had something to do with why Grant disliked Rosecrans. Also, perhaps Grant blamed Rosecrans for rumors, constant rumors, I might add, that Grant had been drinking at Iuka, and that Grant was a man hounded by his reputation as a man tempted by the bottle, while Rosecrans was a more upright reputation. After his near defeat at Shiloh, perhaps Grant desperately needed to ensure that he, not Rosecrans, was acknowledged as the victor of Iuka and Corinth. Perhaps it was the fact that Rosecrans had enjoyed modest financial success before the war and would enjoy substantial success after it, whereas Grant had met with repeated failure in nearly every civilian field he attempted. And just to remind you, again, we're looking at reasons why Grant may have disliked Rosecrans so much. Maybe it was because Rosecrans was loved by his men to a degree Grant never managed to achieve. Rosecrans' testimony before the Joint Congressional Committee to investigate the war in January of 1865 probably didn't help matters either. There's really no way to know what General Grant's reasons were. The post-Civil War public attitudes about General Grant, frankly, most Southerners regarded him as a butcher. His victories were demeaned as the mere application of brute strength. There were Northern critics as well, who claimed that he lacked true genius and that his primary military abilities were simple stubbornness and tenacity. Among his greatest supporters, of course, were those who had served under him, at least the Grant men, Greenville Dodge, Phil Sheridan, William Sherman, Eli Parker, and Chief of Staff John Rawlins, not to mention the sycophantic Adam Badeau and many others, all praised Grant in print and in public. Regardless of any of that, he was popular enough to twice win the Electoral College by overwhelming majorities. That probably speaks for itself in terms of his overall popularity. As to his generalship, among historians, by Civil War's end, the overarching tendency of the era seems to have been the recurrent theme that Grant was a capable soldier and had the good fortune to be in command of a larger army with greater resources than his adversaries. His willingness to expend those resources, frontal wave charges is what in the field is what that's probably referring to. His willingness to expend human resources, both human and otherwise, was, according to this theory, the primary cause of his success. These general viewpoints as to his generalship seem to have remained constant up to and throughout General Grant's presidency and to his passing up until 1885. The Battle of Iuka, Mississippi is generally regarded as the beginning of the Grant-Rosecrans feud. That lasted for the rest of their lives. Iuka is situated in a valley on what was then, at least, Memphis and Charleston and the Mobile and Ohio railroads. In addition to its natural beauty, it's noted for its fine mineral springs and was a fashionable resort before the war. And I wrote parenthetically, its mineral springs water in Iuka is so good that it was voted the very best at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Again, you see a close-up there and kind of over to the right of your screen in the background of a casualty report of General Little's division at the Battle of Iuka. I just find documents like that remarkable, and I really enjoy visiting small county museums. They have some really interesting things there. So let's ask ourselves, what's the rub with Iuka? How come it is with Grant-Rosecrans feud always Iuka is considered the genesis of that feud? Well, the allegation is that Rosecrans was late in attacking the Confederates and that his actions resulted in Price's forces escaping. Further, Rosecrans rode at the back of his column and was not in position to direct the attack. Moreover, Rosecrans did not pursue the retreating Confederates once the attack was over. Reduced to the nub, too many historians have portrayed this event as if Grant was playing some sort of grand chess match or had an overall strategy to drive the Confederates from North Mississippi, only to have Rosecrans come along and spoil it all. The most crucial fact, among all of the facts, the most crucial fact is that at this time, Grant had no grand strategy for the Corinth Iuka campaign and was reacting to events as they occurred. In all likelihood, the planned envelopment of Price's army at Iuka was Rosecrans' idea all along. If anybody wants to point fingers, it would probably be more accurate to say that Grant and General Ord, spoiled Rosecrans' plan. And at our September meeting, we're going to talk about the actual Battle of Iuka. And there was, we'll see how the plan was to not only for an envelopment to surround, but it was for, I think, a double envelopment, meaning not only the front and the rear, but the sides as well would be cut off all possible means of escape. And that didn't happen exactly. With regards what most historians have said about the Battle of Iuka, the following quotation is perhaps the most egregious example of quoting Grant as the sole source of information contained in Grant's memoirs. This quote is taken from the late and the quite distinguished Sir James Marshall Cornwall, who wrote Grant as military commander. It came out in 1970. I'm not at all picking on Sir James Marshall Cornwall. He was from England. He served the Allies in World War I and World War II, and was a very distinguished general and a very honorable man. But he wrote this book, Grant as Military Commander. He also wrote a similar book, I believe it was on Napoleon. And this, in my estimation, is an example of somebody, an author, getting a little bit out of their lane, if you will. You can't just read some memoirs and some newspaper articles and come away and rewrite that and publish it as a book, but it appears that's what happened. Here's what the quote is. Grant's plan to crush Price at Iuka was a complete failure, for which the blame must largely be laid on Rosecrans. Firstly, Rosecrans was slow in carrying out his approach march from Jacinto. He had only 18 miles to march, but reached his assembly area 10 hours late. He also took the wrong approach road, leaving the Iuka-Fulton road open for the enemy's withdrawal. Rosecrans marched in the rear of his leading division instead of at its head, so failed to deploy his second division to outflank Price's position. Finally, he failed to carry out an energetic pursuit. Sadly, too many historians have picked up on this kind of narrative. We shall review what most historians have said about Rosecrans' pursuit of Price. We're going to do that today. And we'll take up the actual Battle of Iuka at September's roundtable meeting. As to the escape, we want to address that and only that tonight as part of the battle. And we can start by saying that 7 Confederate brigades escaped from Iuka during the early morning hours of September 20th, 1862. What did General Grant have to say about that? In his preliminary report, written on the day the battle ended, which was September 20th, Grant told General-in-Chief Henry Halleck that Rosecrans was in full pursuit and would certainly do great harm to Price's fleeing command. The report was praiseworthy of Rosecrans' Iuka command. Grant stated to Henry Halleck, "I cannot speak too highly of the energy and skill displayed by General Grant in this attack." That was the day of the attack. Grant's first report. Following Rosecrans' somewhat insensitive report himself, submitted on September 29th, about 10 days later, General Grant submitted a second, more negative report on October 22nd of the same year. However, that report never became public knowledge until it appeared in the New York Times in April of 1865. And his second report about Rosecrans and the Battle of Iuka, Grant said, Grant's words were that, except for criticism, Grant's second report hardly mentioned Rosecrans at all. Rather, Grant stated that Generals Hamilton and Stanley were in pursuit of the Confederates when Grant arrived in Iuka early that morning, the next morning. In his report, Grant told Halleck that he had been disappointed at Rosecrans' lack of progress. Again, that was Grant's second report on Iuka. With the passage of time, Grant's opinion of Rosecrans' actions at Iuka grew more negative. By the time he finished his memoirs in 1885, Grant had completely soured on Rosecrans. As to the Iuka pursuit, Grant stated, the enemy was not being pursued even by the cavalry. It was in Grant's memoirs that Grant began using words such as neglect, failure, and disappointed to erroneously describe Rosecrans' actions at Iuka and elsewhere. Unfortunately, it's Grant's second and later reports that historians have frequently chosen to repeat. The picture on the right is where as many as 163 unknown Confederate soldiers of Sterling Price's command were laid to rest after the Battle of Iuka. I think that I'm sure it undoubtedly includes many who died later at the hospital under care, and also as well as some in the actual battle itself. Grant's memoirs incorrectly assert that Rosecrans did not pursue Price after Iuka. According to Dr. Varney, the Rosecrans papers contain copies of numerous dispatches from Rosecrans to his subordinates sent during the pursuit, in which Rosecrans issued orders to his men and passed along information. The impression they give is of a man very much in control of circumstances, actively directing affairs and making every effort to close with the enemy. It was Grant himself who called off the pursuit at the end of the second day. I really like this picture that hangs at the museum in Iuka. The Confederate soldiers. The only thing I'm not noticing, I don't see any swords, and I'm sure they didn't carry rifles, but I don't see any swords or rifles on those beautiful horses. Maybe I'm just looking at the wrong side. Rosecrans' cavalry began the pursuit at approximately 8 a.m. And I apologize for not covering the battle first, but the battle occurred on the 19th. Skirmishing began with Rosecrans, and the Confederates began around, say, 12 o'clock noon, and by 4:30 p.m. they were engaged in heavy battle. That lasted until about sunset, and it was 8 a.m. the next morning that Rosecrans' cavalry began the pursuit of the retreating Confederates. Generals Hamilton and Stanley began the infantry pursuit around 8:30, about 30 minutes later. Rosecrans' men were asked to pursue the retreating Confederates in spite of the fact that Rosecrans' men had not eaten in 24 hours, had not been issued rations in 3 days, and had just fought a major action the evening before. Why General Grant and General Ord did not dispatch some fresh troops to go after the Confederates is an unknown, rather than send Rosecrans exhausted men in that direction. What was interesting to me in the Confederate retreat was how Major Wilcox on the right, I believe it was the 3rd Michigan Cavalry, who fought almost from the beginning to the very end of the war, and they found themselves here at Iuka. And what they tried to do was to get in front of Price's retreating army, but they were unable to because they were stopped by Colonel Armstrong of Confederate cavalry, and there was some very interesting cavalry maneuvering going on during that time period. We must ask ourselves, where was Grant while the pursuit of Confederates after the Battle of Iuka was occurring? Where was Grant? They met in what I'll call downtown Iuka in the square there early the next morning. And Rosecrans continued to pursue Price. Grant and Ord did not. They not only did not fight in the battle, but they did not engage in any of the pursuit. While Rosecrans was driving the Confederates out of Iuka towards Tupelo, Mississippi, Grant returned to Burnsville, I'm not sure, maybe 8 or 10 miles away. He went to Burnsville to the train station. Then he went back to Corinth. Then he went to Jackson, Tennessee, over the line, some maybe 40, 50 miles. And from there, he took a train to St. Louis to visit his family while Rosecrans was pursuing Price. For September's program, we'll take a look at the actual Battle of Iuka. The relevant data we'll be working with is size of General Price's army was around 17,000 soldiers, including cavalry, infantry, and artillery. And to my knowledge, they were all effective. In other words, they all had weapons and were able to fight. Unlike when Price, his expedition into Missouri a couple of years later, where many in Price's army were not equipped with weapons and so forth. Rosecrans at Iuka had some 7,000 troops, 2 divisions assigned to him. Ord at Iuka had around 6,000. Grant had approximately 900 of Ord's men. And those were the forces that were to be used to do a double envelopment of Price's army at Iuka. And I was just a specialist 4 in the Army, and I didn't have any combat training, although I did have some infantry training. And I didn't go to war school, but I think, so I understand a double envelopment is something like a hammer and anvil, or sometimes called a pincer's movement. That was the plan at Iuka, and we'll see in September's meeting how General Price was able to escape that envelopment. I would like to also say, nearest I can determine, or others, if I'm reading correctly, there were approximately 475 killed in action. That would be from both sides at the Battle of Iuka. And those estimates are likely understated, but that's the figure that at least I'm working with, 475, which puts it somewhat on the order of Wilson's Creek, Missouri, in terms of the number of killed in action. It's far lower than Pea Ridge, though. So we'll look at some of that in September. And that's the end of my program tonight. So just now's the time we open things up for discussion and questioning.
I have a question, Billy.
Oh, okay. Evan has a question.
Did this Badeau, did he leave behind a lot of letters and so on praising or falsely praising Grant?
Yes, yeah. The question here in our studio here is Adam Badeau, whose name I mentioned twice tonight, Brigadier General. He as we learned from the report I did on Grant's memoirs, I guess it was about a year ago or last spring it was. Badeau styled himself as General Grant's biographer, and he wrote and published books on history of U.S. Grant. So yeah, he was very much involved. And as far as Grant's memoirs, remember the famous Missourian Samuel Clemens, whom we know as Mark Twain. He assisted General Grant. I think they became not only acquainted, but perhaps good friends. He assisted in publication of Grant's memoirs. However, Mark Twain did not at all write Grant's memoirs, nor did anyone else. That was his own wording for that. But Adam Badeau certainly played a very significant role in publishing and otherwise piling biographies of General Grant. What do I do now, Harold?
Is anybody out in the cyber world wanting to ask a question?
Well, the question is anyone from, y'all can just unmute your speaker if you want to, and just speak up if you have any questions.
I have a question um, as to Grant's motivation for writing his memoirs. I understand that he eventually ran into rather hard times um, after the war, and that this was perhaps more than just um, a historical account. He had a vested interest in selling his books.
Oh, yes, very much so. And it may have been the main reason he started writing. I've forgotten, his memoirs came out at his death in 1885. Prior to that, at some point in time, and it probably was around the time he was in the presidency, he entrusted his money to other individuals, a partner, as I recall, and he lost all of his money. It wasn't a great fortune, but it was certainly what he needed to support his family. And as I recall, it was $250,000 in mid-19th century dollars. So a very substantial sum of money, and Grant lost it all in the stock market. He was himself was faced with having throat cancer, and as a means to support his family, his wife, and they had children, he began writing his memoirs. I'm pretty certain it was with the intent of selling them, and that's indeed what happened. And they were highly successful, and as we've said, they've never gone out of print. So that's a very good question. Okay, well, that appears to be everything tonight.
Any other questions out there? Well, guys, I apologize again for the late start and all the confusion we had, but I think Bill did an excellent job getting his way.
John, did that come through in Iuka?
Yeah, it came through loud and clear. Kind of an aside, because the Federals didn't accomplish their objectives, and because Price's army survived to fight another day, I tend to regard it as a de facto Confederate victory.
Yes, that's a very good point. And so did the Confederates, and I failed to make that point, which I should have. For example, the very day before the Battle of Iuka on the 19th, Van Dorn was given command over General Price, as I recall, and Price was already planned to evacuate Iuka. They already had their wagons packed, and they were simply did what they had planned to do all along, which was to withdraw from Iuka. So it certainly could be looked as a success for the Confederates in that regard. And I think they did. I think Sterling Price himself, as I understand it, was really wanted to go to battle the very next day. But some of his officers convinced him to go ahead with the plans to evacuate and meet up with Van Dorn. And on the retreat, they did go south, and I think I saw a map today where they actually went through the road through Bryce's Crossings for the linking up with Van Dorn to attack Corinth.
I think if General Little had survived, at one point they were about ready. General Price's forces were about ready to turn the flank on the Federals, but he was shot, so the order never came through. And the impression I get is that Price Price was demoralized by General Little's death. Well, and plus he was beside when General Little was shot. He and Price were in conversation, but
Yes.
that part is
Yes.
just speculation.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly examine that some more at our next report. This is part one of IUCA, and we'll do part two in September, and we'll look at the death of General Little. I know when Price became aware that the being approached by the Federals from the South, the first person he called upon was General Little, and
Yeah.
as you said, John, he was shot while in the saddle. General Little was shot and died instantly, and he eventually was buried in Baltimore, as I recall.
Yes. Yeah. After the
And
war,
are there any other questions tonight then, or comments? Thank you
no, I
all for
think
participating.
no. This was fantastic.
Okay, well, we apologize for the delay and the technical difficulties, but our host tonight we just couldn't quite get set up there with our in-house Wi-Fi. So we came to Harold's house, and hopefully this will get put on our YouTube channel. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, we ask that you click the like button, and we'll be put right up there. We're the small guys for roundtable groups. We like to think that our presentations are very informative. And if you click the like button, we'll get put right up there with Atlanta and Chicago and Southern California. So thank you
If
for
you would,
participating
yeah,
tonight.
if you would please, when you get it on YouTube, could you email me? And if it's all right, I'd like to put a link on the museum's website to it.
Yes, John, we'll be happy to do that.
We can do it.
No problem.
Appreciate that. And get you some more likes.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
I'm having trouble with this thing. Stop recording.
I had a sore throat, Wayne. And having a
Couldn't tell.
sinus
Pretty
stuff.
good.
All this pollen's been getting
Yeah.
June cough drop.